to become really proficient at any specific task, you've got to practice it and do it for a long period of time. So if you stretch your training out over a longer period of time, you're not going to want to train at that unsustainable rate that you were doing with doing 100 pull-ups as fast as you can 2 or 3 times a week.
You're listening to the Ethos Athletes podcast, where we believe that your health is the number one resource you need to accomplish your dreams. My name is Dr. Matthew Hernandez, and I'm a physician dedicated to helping my patients maintain their active lifestyle and continue doing what they love. I'm sitting down with other experts so that we can provide our listeners with the knowledge they need to improve their health and live their best life. Hey everyone, this is Dr. Matthew Hernandez, and you're listening to the Ethos Athletes podcast, where we provide resources for you to continue to live an active lifestyle. We are continuing our strength training series. During this series, we're basically talking about different ways to train based on the goals that you are trying to achieve. So in our previous episode, we discussed the goal being hypertrophy, and enlarging your muscle mass essentially, and what some of the things that you can do and things to consider when you're wanting to train for hypertrophy. Today we're going to be discussing one of the things that I'm the most interested in, and that's muscle endurance. For this series, we have our guest August Schmidt, who is the owner of East Valley CrossFit, Iron Athlete Clinics, and the president of the Arizona Weightlifting Federation. So August, welcome back.
Thank you, Dr. Matt. Great to be with you.
As I mentioned, we discussed hypertrophy in the last episode and talked about ways to build muscle size, essentially. And today we're going to be discussing muscle endurance, which seems to be pretty complex, and there's so many different things to consider when we're looking at muscle endurance. So can you start off by defining what we mean by that, and then we'll kind of dive in from there?
Yeah, getting a definition of what we mean is going to be important to having a conversation that's valuable and makes sense for people that are trying to digest it. Basically, on a very simple level, muscular endurance is just going to be a situation where you are able to repeatedly perform some muscular contraction. You can get into a broad spectrum of different definitions of it or different ways of doing it. So, for example, you may have muscular endurance in terms of an Ironman triathlete. That's going to involve being able to do submaximal motions repeatedly for hours on end. So I think 8 hours or something is a fast time for an Ironman. So that's like 113 miles, I believe it is, on a bike. So that's being able to repeatedly push the pedal for 113 miles. Okay, it's going to be submaximal effort, but it's a big adaptation just to be able to get it to the muscle to fire that many times in that same pattern for that duration. Mm-hmm. On the other end of the spectrum, looking at muscular endurance, you could take a test like the football players that are going into the NFL, the NFL Combine. Their upper body strength test, and I'm not sure how they came to this as the test, but it's bench pressing 225 for max reps. That's also muscular endurance, but it's very different type of muscular endurance. So you could call them both muscular endurance, but you got to be careful not to convolute the two as the same thing because they're very, very different.
Two different ways of training completely.
Yeah. So, for example, with the bench press 225 for reps, absolute strength is going to be a big factor in that. The more you can do for a one repetition max is probably going to have a pretty linear relationship to the number of reps that you can do with 225. So an athlete that benches 300 pounds may push 225 for 10 reps. An athlete benching 400 pounds may push it for 20, 25 reps, maybe more. And as your absolute strength goes up, your capacity to perform reps with that lighter weight should increase. Okay. Obviously, there's diminishing return on that as you continue to go up. Yeah, it's a lower percentage of your max. You know, if you bench 450, 225 is 50% of your max. If you bench 300, it's 75%. So you're going to have different capacity with that.
Okay.
And that would pretty much be the case even if that person with a lower absolute strength trained purely for endurance, they're probably still going to have a hard time beating the person with the higher absolute strength on that specific test. There's other tests that are deviating farther from the one rep max bench, like maybe max push-ups. You're going to probably see a decoupling of the relationship there between the one rep max bench and the number of push-ups they can do. There'll be some relationship, but it's not going to be as closely linked as the reps with 225 on the bench because the strength has become less and less of a factor in that equation.
Okay.
So you can look at those kind of as the two ends of the spectrum. Something like a 225 reps test, and the other end is huge, ultra marathons or Ironmans, and something along those lines. And they're going to be very affected in very different ways of training and preparation for it. Other examples of muscular endurance are going to be, it's pretty common, it's pretty functional, and you're going to see it in a lot of sports. Sport like wrestling, obviously you're going to have muscular endurance. Any kind of like track, sprinting, anything like that, there's going to be an element of muscular endurance in it. It's going to, again, vary to the degree based on the demands of the sport. 100-meter dash is going to be a different type of muscular endurance than a 5K runner.
Right.
But there'll be some demand for muscular endurance in both of them. So basically, you have to look at it from like a systemic approach of, okay, do we have the requisite aerobic capacity built so that our body can process and bring in the required energy and remove the required waste products in order to continue to function. And then you get more specific into your training, where you would get into more like your anaerobic training, where you're doing intervals and things like that to try and prep for that type of muscular endurance. And then you could also go into your pure power training, where you're very, very short bursts of power with full recoveries, just working your creatine phosphate system. And you would just do those repeatedly, and you would allow for pretty complete recovery of it, and it would just increase your body's capacity to do that type of work.
Okay.
You can look at it a lot of different ways and look at it for a lot of different purposes. One of the reasons that I'm used to looking at it is training athletes to compete in CrossFit. Muscular endurance was a very big part of CrossFit. Obviously, you had to have the aerobic base in order to do that type of work capacity. And then you had to have, your energy systems had to be trained up. But then there's also the muscular endurance factor. So something you might see is one of the demands in a test may be doing 100 pull-ups as fast as you can, okay? And again, in CrossFit, that's going to be like a butterfly or kipping style pull-up. So you may see athletes do that in 2.5, 3 minutes, if they're highly trained. But how would you go about preparing for that type of test? The first instinct may be, well, I'll just do 100 pull-ups as fast as I can 2 or 3 times a week.
Right.
In the near term, you may get pretty fast results to that because it's very specific to the test, and there's going to be some learning and adaptation that is very specific that takes place, so you become more efficient at performing that test. But to become really proficient at any specific task, you've got to practice it and do it for a long period of time. So if you stretch your training out over a longer period of time, you're not going to want to train at that unsustainable rate that you were doing with doing 100 pull-ups as fast as you can 2 or 3 times a week. So then you have to start looking at other ways, more efficient ways, more effective ways of training that are going to be sub-maximal, that are going to not tax you as heavily as doing the actual test itself. Example we were talking about before was if you want to run a marathon, that doesn't mean you have to go out and run a marathon at race pace every day.
Yeah.
No, you do sub-maximal work. Sub-maximal distances are below race pace or race distances. You do a lot of work below race pace. Probably do some at race pace, some above, but you don't do the same thing every time. So you can look at training for something like 100 pull-ups for time and say, okay, how can we define the parts of this and how can we address it? So by the nature of that test, 100 pull-ups for time would be primarily focused on density of work. In other words, how much work can you do in the period of time? Mm-hmm. So the more work you do in less time, the higher the density is. Doing that same work over a longer period of time decreases the density, okay? You could also correlate that to intensity. It's basically, if you did the power output formula, the higher density work is going to have higher power output because you're doing the same amount of work in less time.
Okay.
Then we look at the effects of density. Density is very potent. If you're doing highly dense work, it's going to be very taxing. It's not going to be sustainable work. It's not something that you could do for a prolonged period of time. It's going to be very taxing on your nervous system. It's going to do significant damage to your muscle, connective tissue. It's just going to tax all the systems that are working a lot more heavily than if you did that same amount of work in a less dense manner. So an example of that would be, okay, I'm going to do 100 pull-ups in 3 minutes, or I'm going to do 100 pull-ups over 20 minutes by doing 5 pull-ups a minute every minute.
Okay.
So you're doing 100 pull-ups in both scenarios. You're going to feel very differently during And immediately after both of those, the 100 pull-ups in 3 minutes, you're going to be working pretty much the whole time, and you're going to be very, very taxed immediately after it, out of breath, very, very high levels of waste products built up in your muscle. You're going to be burning. You're going to be very uncomfortable. If you do 5 pull-ups every minute for 20 minutes, if you're trained up in that realm at all, it's probably not going to be very challenging at all. It would probably feel like you weren't doing much. So that's the same amount of work, the difference being the density. Now, that lower density type training is going to be probably the way you should train, probably the bulk of the time that you're training for tests like that. So you would do things like the EMOMs, where you're doing work and then rest, work and then rest, work and then rest, and never go into failure on it, making sure all the movements are good so you're replicating that every time. And then as you got closer to the actual test or competition, then you would probably address the specific test and do it a few times, because there's going to be a learning curve. You're going to learn where your capacity is, how hard you can push into it, about where you should be at what time, and your mind and body will feel it. The first time you feel something that's new, it can kind of almost shock you.
Right.
Like the first time you train hard at altitude, it's kind of a shock to the system. If you do that and then in training expose yourself to training at altitude a few times, it seems like there's a benefit to your ability to perform at the altitude, and there's no way that's a physiological adaptation. That's just that you're not mentally so shocked by experiencing what you're feeling when you're training at altitude. So there's some benefit to doing the actual test itself too, but that's not how you want to do the bulk of your training.
Okay.
So you're doing it in a more submaximal, sustainable way for a long period of time is going to give you more benefit than trying to compress it all into a very short period of time at very high intensities. You may get more benefit just in the near term, but then you're pretty quickly going to have diminishing returns. You're going to be overtrained. You may have injuries, and you probably don't want to get to that level of discomfort all the time in your training.
Yeah, that makes complete sense.
So it's just distributing the work differently.
Okay. Let's go back. So you said one of the things that we need to look at when we're training for endurance is checking to see if we have the aerobic capacity to even do that right off the bat. What are some ways that can be tested? And is there anything that you do when you're evaluating, like, when you're coaching an athlete, that you're able to look at to kind of test to see where their baseline for aerobic capacity is? Like, what's a good solid test to check that?
Again, it would depend significantly on the sport that you're doing.
Makes sense.
I mean, if you're talking about a power lifter or a weightlifter, not going to be a big issue. As far as having a bunch of aerobic capacity, need to have enough in order to recover from between bouts in training and between training session. Beyond that, you're probably counterproductive by trying to develop too much of it, because your body only has limited ability to recover and adapt. If you're talking about an Ironman athlete, then you're talking about a whole nother level of aerobic capacity, their ability to move that oxygen in and out, circulate it for hours on end. So there are different ways of testing it. I mean, you can pick distances, there's all the old tests that people, step-up tests, 1.5 mile time test. Then you can also go into a laboratory and do a VO2 max test and see where that's at. But basically, if you're training for a specific sport and you're training effectively for that sport, you probably have developed most of that aerobic capacity that you're going to need to